with dinner.
I'm writing to tell you how I really feel. You probably didn't notice, but for the longest time, I've always been there for you. I want you to know what I've done, and I hope by me opening up to you like this, you will hopefully feel the same way for me, and we could be happy together, forever. I remember when we were both 13, when you first transferred to my school. As soon as you walked in, I thought you were the most beautiful girl in the world. When your tranquil blue eyes crossed mine, even though it was for a brief moment, as you scanned across the strange faces in the class, I wanted to be with you forever. I was heartbroken straight away though, when you were paired off with some other guy to show you around the school. You didn't really notice me much. You were always with your group of friends who were so different to mine. Who am I kidding? I never really had any friends. The one thing that got me through all those years of loneliness was watching you, admiring everything you did. The way you gracefully went through your day without faults simply left me in awe, day in and day out. As the years went by, you seemed pretty popular with both the guys and the girls. You were sought after by all the popular guys in the whole school, even by some of the older ones, but you shrugged them off. The girls loved how you looked after yourself. You always had your makeup and hair perfect, which made you admired, but hated. It's sad, but it's human nature to get jealous, and we are all guilty of this crime. What they ended up doing, however, was far out of line. I saw as they pushed you when the teachers weren't looking. They would shove you into any nearby hard object, which more often than not was the wall. When you stumbled and slammed into the wall, the teachers would simply turn and say, "Watch where you're going, dear," and then go about their business, blissfully unaware of what actually happened. Witnessing it happen every other day burned me up inside. Seeing you have this torment for being better than them, it was painful to watch every time it happened. I hoped it would die down, but it got worse. I saw when the bullies would knock your drink over when you weren't expecting it, just because the most popular guy asked you out. I was there when they set your bag on fire in the woodwork class because they thought you were condescending when you tried to help them with their work. And I caught a glimpse of that one time they actually threw you to the ground outside the school gates and kicked you until you cried, simply because you tried to tell the teacher about what they were doing. After that incident, they followed you home. Usually, they wouldn't do anything but yell abuse at you. The worst part was, you'd never know when they'd snap and suddenly attack you when walking inches away from your back. It tore me apart to see the girl I loved feel so vulnerable. I wanted to fix it. What I knew was there was 3 main bullies that were consistent. I knew more, but they seemed to do it out of peer pressure. The main culprit was that narcissistic whore Bethany. Beth was simply jealous of everything about you. All the things I mentioned that made you great burned her up inside. She used to be the center of attention, and my gosh, did she love it. All the guys wanted to be with her, and all the girls wanted to be her. The only difference is that she used it for her own personal gain, and ultimately abused it. She slept with most of the guys who showered her in gifts, or had their mommy and daddy to pay for everything. She only hung around with girls who she deemed lower than her, and she demeaned them so that they wouldn't be a threat to her god complex. But slowly, over the years of you being in the school, she eventually lost her reputation, because then all the attention was on you. The second who had a disgruntled grudge against you was that asshole Chris. He asked you to the school's annual dance in front of both his friends and yours, and you simply rejected him like many others. But what made his instance different was that he ran off crying. He was publicly embarrassed, which, in school, meant a lot. He denied liking you and lost his friends and reputation, so he took out his frustrations on who he thought caused all of it. You. The last person was Julie. She had it bad for you ever since the guy she liked always talked about how amazing you were, whilst not paying any attention to her. Even after she performed some, well, let's say desperate deeds for him. During the last week of school, I knew they had something special planned for you, so I took it into my own hands to deal with it, because I love you, and I didn't want your last few days at school to be ruined. The first person I convinced not to mess with you anymore was Chris. Now, he was much stronger than me, being into all the school sports. Plus, the alleged steroids meant I would not be able to take him in a simple one-on-one fight. But in the end, that would be his downfall. I knew where he kept his steroids. It wasn't hard to figure out, since our school security and reputation was so low, there was no need to hide it. I got his locker's combination by saying I forgot mine. The teacher gave me a list of everyone's combination. Yeah, that's right. They have no sense of security in this school. I cracked open his locker with ease, leaving no trace of it ever being opened. I found the next shot he was going to use and squirted a little bit out, then pulled the plunger back out to where it was, leaving a considerable sized air bubble. I figured Chris is no doctor, nor does he have any clue how everything works altogether. He just injects himself, then trains in the school gym. I bought a pass for the gym and watched as I pretended to train. He eventually came into the gym laughing hysterically with his friends. Enjoy it while you can. It's not going to last long, was the thought that cropped up in my head. He went to his locker, and not long later came out dressed up in his training attire, with a determined look on his face. He was ready to start. He was fine for a while, but eventually slowed down. He had a puzzled look on his face as his body slowly gave up. And eventually, the cardiac arrest set in, and he was on the floor. People tried CPR, but there was no defibrillator around, since it was a school full of teenagers. Who would expect a heart attack in a place like this? I smiled and walked out before the paramedics arrived. It was already too late for him. Working my way up the list, Julie was next. She was always jealous of the way every guy liked you. I silently slipped through her window without her noticing. I knew her parents were out, so if she made a noise, no one would immediately come to her aid. I pounced on her while she was sleeping, pinning her down. I tied her hands to the bedpost, and then her legs. I pulled out several jars from my bag, each one almost black. Upon closer inspection, if you looked carefully at the gaps, you would see small movement. They were full of all the creepy crawlies one would typically find in the bottom of anyone's garden. I took my time filling these up with every insect I could find. I wanted her to understand all that pain you must have felt all that time she was shouting abuse at you, hurting you, making you feel lower than you really are. I propped her mouth open with one of those plastic rings a dentist would use for a long procedure. I slowly poured each jar down her throat. Every time her screaming was muffled a little further by the buzzing and scuttling noises the bugs were making as they adjusted to their new home. Tears streamed down her face as I repeated how all of this was for you. A few jars in, I could feel the bugs in her stomach where I was sitting the whole time. By this time, she had pretty much passed out from the pain. When this happened, I'd wait, pour water on her face and slap her until she responded. For punishment, I'd take off the ring from her mouth and pour water down her throat, making her swallow the insects and causing them to go in a frenzy of panic. Eventually, during the 5th jar, the pain of all the insects burrowing into her internal organs, plus all the internal bleeding, caused her to pass away. But not peacefully, of course. I saved the worst until last. I had something special planned for Bethany. She was by far the worst to you. She made your life a living hell, and this was unacceptable. No one as perfect as you should ever have the displeasure of even knowing these people. So I carefully set the pieces and waited. One day, I got a head start. I skipped the last class, but no one noticed, not even the teacher. This shows how much I was noticed in school. By this time, I had memorized her route home. I waited in an archway I knew she walked past every time. I waited and thought about what I was going to do and how it was all for you. Although I didn't have to think too much because I already had it all planned out. When I caught sight of her, I grabbed her and pulled her to the ground. She was kicking and screaming, but at this point in her journey home, there was no one ever around. The archway was to an abandoned, derelict church. I dragged her away from the path and towards the building so no witness would intervene and no one would find her body anytime soon. I did my routine of tying her arms and legs to secure posts, so I knew there wouldn't be much of a struggle. I also gagged her, as I knew she would be making a lot of noise for what I was about to do. I slowly pulled out my knife, making sure she caught sight of its shiny glimmer. I placed the point of it on her lower leg and smiled as she reacted to the sharp point of the blade. I slowly pushed down, making sure the wound was clean as it slowly slipped into her flesh. It took a while, but eventually the knife's handle was touching her skin. I took my time pulling it out, making sure the wound did not rupture with that easily recognized crimson liquid. That would have meant her death, and that would be too easy. As soon as the tip of the knife exited her body, I immediately wrapped the split up with a bandage, applying enough pressure to cut the bleeding down to a minimum. I then placed the knife a little higher up her leg, doing the same thing. I stared into her eyes as she helplessly watched me do this over and over, all over her body. After every stab, I would say a remark about how you didn't deserve what she did to you. Eventually, her whole body was nothing but red bandages. She was barely conscious as I slipped the final blow through her heart. I can imagine you're screaming about now. In fact, I know you'll be. And I will be close enough to hear it. And by you stopping, I know you've gotten to this point in my letter. So I'll start making my way in. It's pretty easy to get into your house after the first few times. You probably thought it was your parents who left this letter in your room in the first place. No, it was me. Don't be afraid of the noise downstairs. It's only me. Put down the phone. I know by now you've got it in your hand, but I've cut the phone line. Don't bother calling your parents if you haven't done already. I've already silenced them. You can stop your screaming now. I am almost right outside your door. Unlock it now, and soon it'll just be you and me, together, forever. Lots of love, your secret admirer.
As I'm sure many of you know, a few days ago was Valentine's Day. A day to celebrate love and togetherness. A day single people tend to loathe. For me, though, it's a day to be feared. It all started a few months ago. I was hanging out with a friend at a college party. It wasn't anything crazy, just a handful of people, some beers, and some good music. I was reluctant to go to the party because I was in the middle of cramming for upcoming exams, and I didn't want to fail. Though, against my better judgment, I let my friend talk me into going. He kept saying, "Come on, you study too hard. You need to loosen up." Even though he was a walking bad influence cliche, he did have a point. I was burning the candle at both ends, and I needed a break. So, we went to this party. When we got there, my buddy, let's call him James, knew almost everybody there. He was that type of person, you know. The type who knows everyone and is generally liked among most people. I, on the other hand, didn't know a single person at this party. While James mingled with people, I leaned against a wall and sipped my beer quietly. I always hated when friends did that. They bring you somewhere and end up talking to others while you get left to your own devices. I was about to call it quits after only 15 minutes of being there when I heard a voice next to me. "Lame party, huh?" The statement caught me off guard and I almost sprayed my beer everywhere. I looked over and standing right next to me was a girl. I was confused for a moment because I was leaning against the only free wall in the room, and I hadn't noticed her walking over to me. It was like she materialized out of thin air. After a moment trying to regain my composure, I noticed she was still waiting on a response to her previous question. I nodded and said, "Parties aren't really my thing." She laughed, almost a little too hard. I didn't think my statement was all that funny, but I chuckled alongside her. She then introduced herself. She said her name was Wendy. I nodded once again as my reclusive nature began to rear its ugly head. I could hear James in my head saying, "See? This is why you need to go out more and develop those people skills." I shook the annoying voice from my mind and introduced myself. I then asked what brought her to a party like this. She began her story, and during this, I started to notice how cute she really was. She had short brown hair cut into a bob. Her eyes were pale blue. Light freckles dotted her face, and every time she stopped to think about what to say next, she'd smile brightly. I sipped my beer and nodded while she spoke. A few minutes later, she pulled out a slip of paper and a pen from her pocket and scribbled something down on it. She told me she had to leave, but to give her a call to go get coffee sometime. I was shocked as she handed me the paper and walked away. It's not every day a cute girl gives you her number. Shortly after she left, James came running over to me. He told me that I shouldn't be sulking against a wall and to go chat with some people. I just returned a childish smirk and held up the number I got. He snatched the piece of paper out of my hands like lightning and scanned the number methodically. After a few seconds, a Cheshire grin grew across his face and he patted me on the back. "I knew you had it in you," he shouted at me. "So, what's her name?" he said coyly. I told him it was Wendy. His grin faded almost instantly. He then rested an arm on my shoulder and shook his head. "Sorry, man," he said. "Wendy is no bueno." I asked him what he meant by that, and he just looked at me and said, "Wendy's crazy." I shoved him and told him that he was just jealous that a cute girl liked me and not him. James just nodded before replying. "Sure, whatever, man. Just be careful around her, okay?" So a month passed, and I had hung out with Wendy a few times. We grabbed some coffee, caught a movie, and even had an actual date. I did start to notice something, however. James was a jealous dumbass. Wendy was perfectly fine in every way. She liked a lot of the same things as me, we got each other's jokes, and genuinely enjoyed being around each other. Things were going surprisingly well for that first month. The following month, finals were breathing down my neck, and I had no time for myself, let alone anyone else. I told Wendy this, and she said she completely understood. But around a week before finals, I started to get strange texts from her. A lot of texts from her. The first 10 were very supportive and encouraging. The next 20 were a little less supportive and more on the clingy side. A lot of "I miss yous" and asking me to stop studying to see her. The next 30 were very passive-aggressive. Things like, "Fine, if you don't want to see me, I get it." Or, "I knew I wasn't good enough for you." Stuff like that. This raised many red flags. Not to mention, I had just received around 60 texts from her over the course of a week. I think I was beginning to understand why James had said the things that he did. After finals were done with, I met up with Wendy and told her that things weren't working out between us. She just returned a laugh and did something I didn't quite expect. She agreed with me. She said that we probably weren't very good together. I was actually happy to hear that. I wished her all the best and I left. About a week passed since our talk and I hadn't heard anything from her. I thought that it was truly over and I could continue with my life. Then, one night, I was awoken to the sound of someone banging at my front door. I got up and checked my clock. It was 2 a.m. I lazily got out of bed and walked over to the door and opened it. Nobody was there. At first, I didn't put two and two together. I thought it might have been some kids playing a prank on me, so I shut my door and went back to bed. Another few days passed, and after coming home late in the evening, I found a piece of paper sticking out from underneath my doormat. I picked it up and looked at it. The note said, "I missed you today. I can't wait to see you again." Immediately, I knew who the note was from, and I started to feel a bit concerned. I looked around to see if anyone was nearby, but my entire street was empty. I went inside, locked my door, checked my windows, and went to bed. The next morning, as my alarm sounded, I rolled over to turn it off, and I felt something on my nightstand. It was another piece of paper. This made my eyes shoot open as I grabbed the paper and read it. "You are cute when you're asleep." I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that she had been in my house while I slept. This was the final straw. I called the police a few hours later after I had searched my entire house and got dressed. I explained to the officer that I had just split up with a girl and that she had broken into my house somehow. He told me that there was little he could do, unless I got a restraining order against her. He said if I caught her in the act, then I could call them and they would handle it. But without proof, there wasn't much he could do. Throughout the rest of the month, I hardly slept. I was always worried that I would wake up to find her standing over me with a knife or something. That brings us to Valentine's Day. A week and a half prior, I hadn't received a single note or hint of her at all. I was thinking maybe she had finally given up messing with me and we could just move on with our lives. Not wanting to spend the day alone, I got up early and headed over to James's place. I made sure to check the locks on my whole house before leaving. I arrived at James's place a little after noon, and we hung out playing video games most of the day. The sun had set and I decided to call it a night. I left James's house and drove across town to my own. As I was walking up the path to my front door is when I noticed it. My entire door was hanging unhinged as if it were forced open. I walked up to it cautiously and pushed the door open. I reached around to the inside and turned on the light switch to my living room. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Red. So much red. My entire living room was covered in a thick layer of red. The scent hit me a moment later. The sickly sweet metallic smell of blood lingered in the air. I immediately backed out from my house and called the police. Ironically, the same cop from before answered the call and showed up. I explained the whole situation and he searched the house. After a moment, he stepped outside and asked if I had gone into the kitchen. I hadn't. He said that he was going to take a sample of blood, but he was pretty sure he knew where it came from. Confused, I walked inside and saw it. My kitchen table was decorated with flowers and candles, with a table setting for two. One chair was completely empty, while the other had a large pig carcass taped to it. There was a picture of my face taped over the pigs. I spent that night cleaning bloody hearts and dripping I love yous from my walls, and disposing of the oozing pig carcass. The officer told me that they would bring her in for questioning, but after 2 days they told me they were unable to locate her, but that they'd keep searching. Today I found another note taped to my front door. The note said, "Thank you for the Valentine's dinner. You're so sweet. I can't wait to do it again." I don't know where Wendy is, or why she is even doing this, but I'm starting to get worried that next year will be much, much worse.
You may want to roll your eyes at the next sentence, but just hear me out. My name is Dave. I'm 19 years old, and I know I will never have another relationship or get married. You see, around 5 years ago, I just went through my first and only breakup. I told my friends I dumped her for a hotter chick, but the truth was, she dumped me for my stepsister. But how was I supposed to tell my friends that? That's about the most embarrassing thing ever. My stepsister, who was a year younger than me, managed to steal my girlfriend. Of course, my mother knew about it and was more than supportive to my sister, but she still felt bad for me. She came into my room, put $50 in my hand, and asked if I wanted her to drop me off at the mall for a couple of hours. I slowly nodded my head and started to get ready. On my way to the mall, I texted my 5 friends and told them to join me. My mother tried talking to me while we drove there, but I just silently stared out of the window. When we pulled up to the entrance of the mall, I got out of the car and slowly walked in. Before my mom drove off, she yelled out, "I love you, Dave." I glared her down until she drove away. I was there for 2 hours by myself. None of my friends texted back, and I was getting ready to call my mother to pick me up when I saw the prettiest girl I have ever seen. I don't know what came over me. When she walked past me, I started to follow her. She looked at me and gave me a smirk before turning around and planting the most passionate kiss I have ever felt in my life. My arms were flailing for a couple of seconds before the feel of her lips, the light coconut scent of her hair, and the warmth of her embrace made me lose track of everything. My arms matched her embrace, and I was truly happier than I have ever felt in my life. It felt like days flew by before she pulled away from the kiss. She gave me a short laugh before asking, "If you like that, why not just go ahead and promise to be mine forever?" I was a teenager. My teenage hormones were bouncing all over my body. I don't care how weird her question was. After taking a deep breath, I asked, "How do I do that?" She grabbed my hand and asked, "Just say yes, and I will do whatever needs to be done." Without a second thought, I answered with a quick, "Yes, I want that." She gave me a smile before her body started to melt. I shrieked and tried to jump back, but my hand was stuck to whatever she had become. Soon, she had become a puddle of flesh that surrounded me. Slowly, the liquid started to rise from the ground and slither at my leg. I tried to slap it away, but it easily avoided me and continued to crawl up. I tried yelling, but my throat wasn't responding. Instead, I found myself sitting on the bench with my mouth wide open. Whenever I wanted to struggle, my own body fought against my urges. It kept me still until the liquid started to pour into my mouth. The taste of copper filled my mouth and I started to gag, but the liquid kept flowing down my throat. After around 10 to 15 seconds, the remaining liquid went into my mouth and I regained control of my body. I called my mother and told her to pick me up before I ran into the restroom and tried to puke out whatever was inside of me. I threw up my lunch and even part of my breakfast, but the liquid girl stayed inside of me. For the next couple of months, I monitored myself, but nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary. It still annoyed me seeing my sister making out with my ex, but I got over it. For some reason, I was actually a little bit happier than I normally was. I was a lot more outgoing. I started to excel in all of my classes and quickly became one of the more popular kids in my freshman class. Of course, this drew the attention to several girls, which I did not mind. I wasn't really interested. But out of nowhere, a girl named Molly caught my eye. She was shorter than average, blonde and completely perfect to me. We started to spend more and more time together. I asked her out about a month later, and to my delight, she said yes. That was almost the best day of my life. That night, while I was lying in my bed, thinking about how hard I fell for Molly, I felt something rise out of my throat. I quickly closed my mouth and tried to swallow it back, but the taste of copper came out of my mouth and a small glob of liquid bounced out. I jumped out of bed, turned on the lights, and looked around the room, but I couldn't find anything there. After looking around for a while, I became too tired and fell back asleep. The next morning, when I woke up, I got ready and my mother drove me to school. When I got to school, I noticed something was off. Kids were acting normally until they were stopped by a teacher in front of the school. They turned around and started to walk back to the car they were dropped off in. I ran up to a kid that was in my history class and asked him what was going on. He shrugged and said, "They said someone died in our school." I asked him if he knew who it was, but he just shrugged his shoulders again and walked back to his car. Later on, while I was watching the news, Molly's face popped up on the screen. I dropped the remote on the floor and continued to stare at the screen and hear about what happened to her. She was found in the middle of my first classroom. She had an envelope in her hand. They were investigating all of the tapes, but all they saw was her stopping in the middle of the class and grabbing her throat. She fell to the ground and squirmed around for a couple of seconds before her movements stopped entirely. It took me over 2 years to get over the death of Molly, but for some reason, I felt like I was never truly alone. I tried dating another girl, Grace, about 3 years ago, but I was never really into the relationship. She tried to make the relationship work, but something inside of me was pulling me away from her. After several months of seeing her suffer, I wanted to cut it off with her. But when I walked up to her to break up the next day, I froze in my steps. This was the girl that really went through months of torture to make me fall in love with her. And I really did start to love the girl. The love that I haven't felt since meeting Molly. I walked up to her and grabbed her close to me before planting a kiss on her cheek. I whispered, "I love you," into her ear for the first time. She looked truly happy. The day flew by. After school, we went around the school parking lot for hours and talked about everything important and stuff that was completely trivial. I loved every second of it. When I got home, I immediately started to text her, and we talked until around 1 a.m. Right as I put my phone on the side table and started to drift off, I felt nauseous. I tried with all of my strength to hold it back, but no matter how much I tried, I felt the same taste of copper come out of my mouth. Right as the cup full of goo expelled out of my mouth, I jumped right on the spot I thought it landed on, but it was gone. I tried texting Grace to be careful, but I started to feel the liquid come out of my mouth again. I started choking and tried to grab whatever was in my throat with my fingers, but before I put my fingers in my mouth, I felt it rush out of my throat. It was the girl that I saw at the mall. I tried reasoning with her, but she raised her hand and a blur flashed across my face. I woke up the next morning to a bunch of texts on my phone. They were all about Grace. She was dead. She was found in a room. I called her brother, John, on the phone, and through sobs, he described how he found her. She was lying on her bed. Her hands were around her neck. Her face was completely blue. Her neck had several gashes. Her blood surrounded her dead body. He swore up and down that he saw a pinkish liquid coming out of her mouth. She was the last one I fell in love with. I have tried everything I can to stay out of the way of anyone I felt like I had a chance of falling in love with. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and see the girl I saw at the mall. The girl that is now a permanent part of me. No matter how many times I have seen her, I cannot describe what she looks like. All I know is that she is everything I desire in a woman. Like I said, I tried really hard to stay out of the way of love, but just the other day, I met a girl. Her name is Amber. I helped her study for a communications exam. She gave me her number, and we are going out to a movie. I hope I don't fall in love. For months, I caught glimpses of Clara from the safety of my cubicle. So beautiful, faultless. Through innocent eavesdropping and pattern recall, I unknowingly learned almost every detail of her life. When she had lunch, who her friends were, and where she would be at any given moment of the workday. I even knew where she lived, as we both took the same bus to work. On the long commutes, she never so much as batted an eye in my direction, unfazed by my existence. Admiring from afar was all I ever did. But, on this day, I felt an inexplicable urge to connect with her. After settling in at my workstation, I became aware of a grouping of words that made up an ominous internal dialogue. This is the day. She will be yours. My blood ran cold. The choice of words and the cadence with which they were spoken. This voice was not my own. "Hello?" I asked quietly, unsure of what I'd heard was even really there. A reply confirmed its presence. "You need her." I stood upright, officially rattled. "Who's there?" By this point, everyone was staring at me, including her. I smiled awkwardly. She made a perturbed look and walked away, seemingly frightened. A wonderful first exchange. Everyone else averted their eyes and returned to work. I sat down and attempted to do the same, chalking up my bizarre experience to a lack of sleep. I sugarcoated the denial further with an internet search that backed up this theory and confirmed that audible hallucinations were also a, very rare, side effect of the new allergy medicine I was taking. Satisfied with my haphazard research, I craned my neck around the confines of my cubicle and noted that Clara was shuffling some papers around at the copy machine. A strange feeling overcame me in this moment. For whatever reason, I felt I could bear the distance between us no longer. My legs began moving, opposite the signals my brain tried sending them to stop. I couldn't believe what I was doing, but infatuation seemed to outweigh my fear. I felt such a strong need to reach out and touch her. Just as I was about to take my final step in a direction, our boss came over and pulled her aside to discuss some work-related matters. I sighed in relief, shaken by my own actions. Another internet search turned up very little evidence that sleep deprivation coupled with certain antihistamines could translate to a hormone imbalance, potentially leading to an increased libido. That must have been it, I thought. Despite its many holes, this explanation sat well with me, at least for a few moments. Chase her down, demand her attention. The voice was back. Panic set in as I dove into my work and did my absolute best to ignore the taunting, as well as my new urges. This was easier said than done, especially with how often Clara walked by my cubicle to get to and from her various workplace destinations. At one point, I almost grabbed a leg as she strolled past. I was able to pull my arm back with the other. Luckily, she hadn't noticed. I tempered my outbursts and went about business as usual. Although we went to work at the same place, Clara always left an hour before I did, just in time to catch the last bus. My projects ran late, so I would usually have a willing co-worker to bring me home. On this day, however, it was the middle of winter, and there was a storm outside. Most of the staff had left early to beat the snow. I would have been smart to do the same, but focusing on my work was the only thing keeping my mind off Clara, which in turn kept the disembodied voice at bay. Closing time snuck up on me faster than expected. Find her. I stopped at the elevator. "Please, just leave me alone," I begged in a hushed tone. The voice repeated its demand, louder this time. "Find her." "No!" I shouted, fed up but still scared. The voice responded in kind. Then suffer. All at once, I stopped breathing. I felt my chest begin to cave in as the oxygen within dissipated. I fell to the floor before I could reach for the phone at my station and call for help. Just as quickly as it started, the episode ended, and air once again filled my lungs. Do not disobey. This warning was enough to render me terrified. From this point forward, I had no choice but to give in to the voice's commands. Some way, somehow, I would have to go to Clara. I pulled out my phone. As expected, there was no ride-sharing services available. A driving ban had just been issued due to the coming weather. Fantastic. Upon exiting the building, without so much as a long-sleeve shirt to keep me warm, I headed off in the direction of Clara's home, backtracking over the route taken by a bus. It would take me roughly 4 hours to get to her by foot. Knowing this, I made long and firm strides in the hopes of minimizing the amount of time it would take me to reach her. While walking down the main street in this fashion, I noticed a lot of businesses closing up for the night due to the approaching blizzard. One of these shops was a local florist. A gift. Knowing what the voice had in mind, I pushed the door open just as the florist was about to lock up, startling the hell out of her. I grabbed the nearest rose I could find, threw some money down on the counter, and left in haste. I did not wish to feel my lungs collapse again. I began power walking towards Clara's house, hoping I would beat the storm there. Before making it too far, I felt a sharp pain in my mind. I looked down and saw droplets of blood splatter across the ground. It was the rose. I had grabbed an uncut one, thorns and all. My palm was now bleeding profusely, but I kept walking. The voice returned to encourage me, but this time it was faint, barely a whisper. She's waiting for you. I trudged through harsh winds, my pace never wavering. The storm was closing in. At about the halfway point, I felt snow. It began falling at a swift and steady rate, making it almost impossible to see in front of me. I stood still with my back to the current in an attempt to catch my breath, but another whispered incentive kept me going. Continue. I pressed on, feeling the sting of the snow on my bare face. After an hour or so, a mark formed on my arm. It was beginning to turn black. This was the onset of frostbite, I guess. It only grew darker as time went on. The other soon followed suit. I could only assume the rest of my skin was turning as well. I was concerned, but not enough to falter and face the deadly consequences. After another long and treacherous hour, I finally arrived at a street. Be with her. The lawn was covered in snow, but I could still see the stone walkway leading the way to the front door. I took a step onto it, but quickly fell to the ground, slipping on a sheet of ice. My arm met the unforgiving ground below. It was more than likely broken, but I couldn't feel a thing. I stood up and kept walking. Having more than likely heard the sound of my fall, Clara opened the front door and walked out to meet me. She said nothing. She simply looked at my frostbitten and disfigured form with a horrified expression. She raised her hands out over her mouth in shock. I reached up and presented her the rose. I had little energy left to speak, but I managed to offer her a couple of words. For you. She stared at me, just as she had earlier. Those eyes of disgust, that look of confusion. It was now turning into sheer terror. Before I could offer an explanation, she began to scream. She screamed so loudly that a splitting pain consumed my ears. My feelings for her would not be reciprocated. Without warning, a swirling vortex of red energy burst from my frozen skin and hung above us. We both cowered in its presence. Before we could escape, the entity rushed to Clara and wrapped itself around her arms and legs, pinning her in place. An all too familiar sound rang through the stormy night, and I understood what was happening. The voice was no longer in my head, and it was not happy with Clara. Kill her. Just as it had earlier in the day, my body moved without me. My arm was raised, and I noticed a red glow emanating from the rose, similar in colour to the entity. I was compelled to strike Clara, to slash her open with his thorns. I did my best to resist, but my possessed legs quickly closed the gap between us. As my arm wound up for the attack, I cried out. "No!" I yelled, to which the entity responded. "Do as you are told." I can't quite explain it, but in this bleak moment, an idea sprung to mind. Less a thought than it was a feeling, a last-ditch effort to fight back. Okay, I'll do it. Just please, release me." "Very well. Make it quick." My restraints were lifted. I was surprised it had complied, but I did my best not to show it. I then looked at Clara with saddened eyes. "I'm sorry." I swung the rose and struck skin. Blood poured out onto the snowy ground. My blood. "What are you doing?" I sliced open every inch of my skin I could see. In a low whisper, the voice pleaded with me. "No, stop this at once, I beg of you." Clara was free of her binding and ran back into the house. I kept cutting until there was a pool of red surrounding me. I fell into it and lost consciousness. When I awoke, I was in a hospital bed. To my left was Clara, asleep in a chair. I was in a great deal of pain, but it seemed my wounds had been attended to. Better yet, I no longer felt the darkness within. I guess my plan worked. I tried to get up, knocking over my IV in the process. The noise woke Clara. "You're awake. Please, lie back. You need to rest." Her eyes was just as beautiful as I remembered. "Are you okay?" I asked. "I'm fine. Just a little frazzled and confused is all." She picked up the IV and handed me a glass of water. "What was that thing? How did you know how to stop it?" I had to dwell on it for a second and recollect all the details. "I don't know. It was a strange sensation I became aware of. I felt as though it was tied to my veins in some way. A blood demon of sorts. Without my blood, it couldn't survive." She stared at me, silent. "You probably think I'm crazy, don't you?" She shot me with an infectious smile. "I was there too. I saw it. I heard it, saw it even. If you're crazy, we both are." We laughed. A far better exchange than my first, if I was keeping score. The rest of the day was nice. We talked for hours and really got to know each other. Before she left, Clara promised she would visit the following day. For a brief window, things were really looking good. But then, a familiar voice broke through, shattering the illusion. "I told you she would be yours."
I've been single my entire life. I really don't mind it. It's just how I've always been. And yet, I still buy Valentine's candy and a card every year. That simple thing saves my life. I moved to a small town right before starting high school. It was difficult trying to make new friends and adjusting to an entirely new place at the same time. By the time February rolled around, I was finally feeling as if I'd gotten into the groove of things. I had only made a handful of friends, and to my shock, the first time I was ever asked out on a date was a week before Valentine's Day. I felt awkward going out with a girl who I'd never spoken with before, so I turned her down. She got angry, claiming she had other options and was just being nice. That might be the case, but her extreme reaction confused me. When I was able to, I asked my friend Travis about it. "Oh yeah, you'd die if you're single on Valentine's Day. Get your heart ripped out and everything. So, find a girlfriend for the day," he explained, and I scoffed at the idea. "Come on, you don't expect me to believe that, do you? I asked, thinking he was just pulling a joke on the new kid. He acted as if he was just giving me some facts. He was looking at me as if I was crazy for not knowing about getting a date or dying. I told him he was crazy, but he just shook his head. It happens every year. Someone gets their heart ripped out. It might not be in this town, but it's nearby. And it's always someone single. I guess you can risk it, but why? It's just one day, he said, trying to defend his point. This was before everyone had a cell phone in their pocket, so I couldn't look up deaths of people missing their hearts right then. I made a note to research it later, so I could call him out on his urban legend. I crossed my arms, still not buying what he was saying. That's stupid. Are you saying, what? Someone knows you're single and kills you? I pressed. A person doesn't do it. Some sort of monster does. No one has lived after seeing it, but people said they heard drums, and then found someone without their heart. Travis was again looking at me, as if I should know all this. A Valentine's Day monster. Really? Well, Christmas has Santa, and there's an Easter bunny, so why can't Valentine's Day have something? For the next 10 minutes, I roasted his idea and belief in the Valentine's Day monster. At least he could take it all as a joke, even if he did believe the murders were real. He wasn't positive a monster was doing it, but couldn't offer up any other reason behind the deaths. And he wasn't risking it. He already had a date lined up with a girl he didn't even like. I still thought the entire idea was dumb. The rest of the school didn't share my outlook. As the day slowly got closer and closer to the fated day, the students got paired up with each other. Some done out of safety, others using the monster as an excuse to finally ask out their crush. I received a few pity offers, but I refused all of them as an act of rebellion against this stupid small town's tradition. I just watched as everyone started dating in fear of death. The store sold out of candy and cards pretty quick. Normally, everywhere would be flooded with red and pink product.
You gotta crank it up.
Frank's Red Hot. I put that on everything.
The shelves were barren a few days before the 14th. Now, I refused to accept any offers, and I didn't plan on asking someone out either. The school offered a program where you could buy sweetheart candies to be delivered to class for a small fee. I didn't mind getting my new friends one each, all while making up silly names to put on the card of who they would receive it from. It was the only thing related to the whole day I gave into, aside from buying a box of chocolates for myself. The chocolates were just a normal box of assorted types from the grocery store. I'd gotten them with some money made from doing chores. When I bought them, the cashier slapped a heart-shaped sticker on the box without my permission, a small one for someone to write who the box was meant for. With how crazy this town was over the holiday, I didn't blame her. By that time, I'd been so overexposed to anything Valentine-related, just seeing the sticker put me off eating the chocolates. I shoved them in my backpack to forget about them until after the 14th was over. I really wish I had taken the entire thing a bit more seriously. It wasn't until the night before Valentine's Day that I finally looked up the murders, finding them to be true. Dread started to form in my stomach as I scrolled through the library computer after school while waiting for my father to pick me up. I didn't find all the mysterious deaths, but enough to make me worried. 3 people were found with their hearts missing. The police said that from the state of their bodies, they were killed on Valentine's Day, even though their bodies weren't found right away. An entire town was warning me about this, and yet I still sat in shock after finding out it was true. My father finally got me from school, but told me I needed to walk home the next day. I sat in the car, silently debating on what to do. He just chalked up my distressed state as normal teenage behavior. I didn't sleep that night. I tried thinking of names of students that might not have a date, all while knowing it was useless. When the clock turned midnight and it was officially the 14th, I nearly had a panic attack, convinced the monster would swoop in to take my heart. The only way I got through that night without a mental breakdown was to shift my train of thought back to what it was before looking up the murders. A Valentine's Day monster was stupid. It wasn't real. Some heartless store manager saw the murders and made up the story to sell more products through fear. That was it. It had to be it. I remained awake all night. In the morning, my mother noticed how I looked and offered to let me stay home. I refused, secretly hoping I could find a date if I went to school. The place was abuzz with new couples and gift exchanges. As I walked down the hallway, a few students looked at me with pity in their eyes. Most knew my single stance and how I would be the monster's top choice, if it was real. No one went near me that day if they could help it. My few new friends awkwardly tried to find reasons to rush off if I tried talking to them. All of them having temporary new girlfriends gave them a good enough reason to be left out. My candy heart prank wasn't funny. Some thought it was, but I couldn't find the humor in anything that day. Instead, I spent it looking over my shoulder, expecting to hear drums at any second. The final bell rang and Travis was brave enough to walk over to me for a chat. I think he thought this was going to be our last conversation. The idea got him motivated enough to walk over, but not to find the words. "Do you, want to come over? I'm going out today, but maybe we can hang out beforehand. There was a really good show and..." He trailed off feeling awkward. "It's fine. I'll just chill at home. My parents are going out and won't be home until after dinner, so I have the entire place to myself. That never happens. They finally think I'm old enough to be trusted to be left alone," I explained, determined to still not believe in this nonsense even though I was terrified. Travis nodded, looking pale. He wasn't brave enough to press me on hanging out. After all, he was certain I was going to die that night. He didn't want to be around to see it. "I'll talk to you tomorrow," I said, and gave him a shaky wave. He gave one back, and started to hurry over to his new girlfriend. When you're a teenager, everything is a big deal. As I walked away from school towards home, I felt like I was walking towards my own death. The sky was overcast. It made me feel even more gloomy. I kept mocking myself for my mood as I walked along the neighborhoods that had become familiar to me over the past few months. Finding a small rock, I started to kick it as I walked, trying to take my mind off the fear in my chest. A car started to drive along behind me with such loud music, I could hear it thumping through the air. I watched it cruise by, a bit annoyed over the sound. If you're going to blast music, at least play something good and not something that just thudded. As the car kept going down the street, the music went with it, but a hint of the thudding remained. I stopped, confused on why I could still hear the sound if the car was so far. When it finally turned out of sight, I realized the car wasn't the source of all the noise. My heart started to beat so fast and hard, it matched the thudding rhythm that I could swear was getting closer and closer. I didn't look behind me, or even get angry at myself for getting scared. I just ran down the street. I should have run up to one of the houses asking for help. I was so frightened nothing rational came to mind. I ran like crazy all while that beating followed. I wish this was a prank, but didn't stop running to find out. My mind was unable to work as my lungs burned from the mad dash. For a moment, I thought I was losing whatever was chasing me. I stumbled, nearly falling over a crooked sidewalk square in front of my house. I couldn't tell how close the thumping sound was over my own heart. Sweat poured down my face and I felt faint. I slammed into my front door, banging on it before I remembered my parents were out. I nearly screamed in frustration. The door was locked and my keys were buried under my books inside my backpack. That thudding sound was all I heard. It was so close, it rumbled in my chest. My hands shook as I fumbled to get the zipper open. I was scared to death and couldn't keep my eyes open. Squeezing them shut, I felt around in my bag for my key. My hand brushed against it when a puff of wind came across my face. I smelled something sweet, and then the wind came again. To my horror, my mind clued into the fact it wasn't the wind, but something breathing on my face. It was too late. Even if I got my key, I couldn't unlock the door before whatever brought the heart-thumping sound took my heart too. I refused to open my eyes to see the monster I now knew to be real. I love the sound of your heart. It's a shame it's alone. Let me add it to the others. The voice that spoke wasn't some prank. It was twisted and beyond anything a human could make. My mind was racing. I felt the sharp tip of a claw poke my chest, leaving a small cut through my shirt. A cruel laugh came as I whimpered in fear. With my hand still in my backpack, I felt something that was not my books or my house key. A crazy idea came to mind. It was either that or death, so I grabbed a hold of the only thing I could think of. Yanking the box of chocolates from my bag, I held it out to the monster I still refused to see. My voice strained and shaking. I asked it a question I prayed would save my life. Will you be my Valentines this year? My heart nearly beat out of my chest. Opening my eyes a crack, I could see the box in my hand, but not the creature that brought along countless heartbeats that mixed in with my own. I should have died. Instead of clawing out my heart, the twisted hand with razor-sharp nails reached out and took the box. I forced my eyes shut, my entire body shaking. Something brushed my face, causing me to tense up so much that it hurt. That clawed finger brushed some hair from my face with another cruel laugh. What a cute child you are. I'll accept this gift this year, but someday, I'll be back to claim your heart. I bit down on my tongue, trying not to scream at that horrible voice. With one final laugh that rattled my bones, the thudding stopped. It took me forever before I gathered up the courage to finally open my eyes. Nothing was on the front step. I was alone. If it wasn't for the rip in my shirt, I would have thought the whole thing came about due to stress and lack of sleep. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I mean, who would believe me? I went to school for the first half of the day on the 15th. I had barely slept for 2 days and needed to take the rest of the day off. But I didn't want my friends to think I died. All of them looked shocked I lived. I just said I got lucky. The school moved on. The short-lived relationships caused by that day fizzled out. As time crept along, I started to dread knowing Valentine's Day was coming yet again. I bought more candy, roses, and a card, expecting a visit from a monster. I should have just gone along and dated somebody, but somehow the idea of it was more stressful than dealing with the monster. I anticipated and feared Valentine's Day, only to have nothing happen. Nothing happens beside the fact that the gifts I addressed to the creature go missing overnight. As the years carried on, I kept buying different gifts with the same result. as I've gotten older, I've heard those terrible heartbeats faintly on Valentine's Day. Each year the sound gets louder. I think this year is finally going to be when that monster shows itself. Again, just asking someone out may save my life. But I think if the monster does show up, I'll ask it the question yet again. But this time, I'll keep my eyes open.